Hi and welcome back to my channel, and of course I'm Arlena, and today I will be sharing another special video with you. And in today's video I will be sharing with you some of my favorite Christian fiction authors. Well, I have quite a list. Back in the day I loved to read. I still love to read, but unfortunately sometimes I don't have the time that I would love to read. But one book I always make sure and I always make time to read, and that's the Holy Bible. But also I love to read Christian fiction. Christian fiction is something that I discovered oh my God, in 2001. And I remember I was saved and I was still reading that secular stuff. And a sister in Christ saw me reading that. She was like, you need to stop reading that stuff. I'm like, so what do you expect me to read? Do you expect me to read the Bible the whole day? No, there's nothing wrong with reading the Bible the whole day. But I just asked her, do you expect me to read it the whole day? And she said, no, you need to be reading some of this. So I'm like, what is that? She said, Christian fiction. I'm like, Christian fiction? I had never heard of Christian fiction. So she started to explain to me a little bit about this book. It was actually a series. And actually that series was the Left Behind series. And when she started explaining to me that it's a Christian fiction series that is based on the book of Revelation, my senses peaked up, because now I knew this was something that I definitely had to read, because what book is more suspenseful or frightening than the book of Revelation? Well, then again, if you are saved and you know of the word, the book of Revelation doesn't frighten you. But I know it was something I definitely had to read, because I just wanted to make sense. How do you actually make this book a fiction book? And it was truly awesome. And the first book I read from out of that series, because when I went to the library, by the time I discovered that, it had already been out. But the only book from that series that I was able to get at that particular moment was the book 2. And that was A Tribulation Force. And I was hooked. And that's actually by B Jenkins and the late Tim LaHaye. So that's how I came about with the Christian fiction. And then also many years ago, I was in, those mail order book clubs. I was in the Book of the Month club, and then they had one that was the Christian book club. I don't know if they're still around, but I got a lot of my books from those book clubs, and I actually had built a library that went with me from New York to California, California to Florida, Florida to St. Martin. And unfortunately, in 2017, Hurricane Irma decided I didn't need to read those books anymore, so she took them and went with them. But that's okay, because that's all water under the bridge. We're starting a new library over again. But in the meantime, I just wanted to share some of my favorite Christian fiction authors. So here we go. First up, none other than Miss Francine Rivers. I love Francine. I love Francine Rivers. I think she's an amazing author, and she loves writing biblical, historical Christian fiction. Sometimes she'll do some contemporary stuff, but a lot of times mainly she focuses and she, on the historical Christian fiction. But she does also do contemporary stuff as well. Contemporary subjects, not contemporary fiction. And my favorite book by her, and she has a slew of books, is Redemption Love. Redemption Love is actually based on the book of Hosea. It's a powerful, powerful story. I had the privilege of purchasing that book for the first time in 2004. I was living in Florida, and I stumbled upon a small independent Christian bookstore, and I walked in, and there it was sitting right there. And I've always heard of the book, but I just didn't get around to reading it. But it was staring at me smack dab in the face. I went into the bookstore because I wanted something to read, and it was sitting there, and I said, you know what, this is the time for me to get that book. And let me tell you, I don't ever regret that purchase. I had that book for 13 years. And that book went with me from Florida to St. Martin. And then, like I said before, after Hurricane Irma, it went through the door. you know, but I had that book for many years and I had the privilege of reading it twice. The first time I read it in 3 days, and I only read it in 3 days because I had to go to sleep, unfortunately. But it was an amazing, amazing read. Another book that I also loved, that I read from her, is Linear. Well, actually, I'm sorry, the Bathsheba. It's from the Linear of Grace series. That was also an excellent book, which is based off of Bathsheba, which was at that time David's concubine, and who later became his wife. It's a very wonderful story, a story of grace and, you know, love and mercy. Great book, and it's very small. It's nothing thick that you can't finish. It's a really good book, really good book. Next up, we have Terri Blackstock. Terri Blackstock is, ooh, I love Terri Blackstock. I love Terri just as much as I love Francine. They both write Christian fiction, but kind of like a little different, I guess, subgenre. Terri kind of more specializes in Christian fiction suspense. Amazing, amazing, amazing. My first book that I read was the Cape Refuge series. That's I think it's a series of either 3 or 4 books. I can't remember, but I think it's 4. And let me tell you, it's amazing. It's, ooh, I fell in love. From the moment I read the first book in that series, I was hooked. I became a Terri Blackstock fan to this day. And that was like about, that was since like 1997, so I'm still a fan. I love her work. Her work is great. And she kind of started out writing secular fiction, and then she walked away, followed the Lord, and of course the calling of the Lord, and she started writing Christian fiction, and it's really been wonderful. So it's, you know, it's suspense mixed with that word. It's just awesome, awesome, awesome. So check that out. Next up, Robert Whitlow. I love Robert Whitlow. Robert Whitlow is my favorite male Christian fiction author. I love his work, and his is also suspense, kind of like Terri Blackstock. The only difference, because he's a lawyer, and a lot of his books, they're centered on those legal issues that go on behind the scenes. And my favorite book by him that I read, actually I read I think like 3 books by him. The first one, which I had the privilege of owning, is The List. I love The List. I recommend The List to anyone that I speak to. I always recommend Robert Whitlow. And when I recommend that to them, I say, listen, he has a lot of books. Get The List first. The List is very informative, very, very bone-chilling, but truthful. Even though it's fiction, the storyline and the premise of the book, I mean, it's stuff that goes on in everyday life, and it kind of shows you how darkness and evil fight against each other, and how, in the outcome, of course, light always wins. Next up is Frank Peretti. Now, I've had the privilege of reading 3 books from Frank Peretti. I always get mixed up with these 2 books. I can't remember which one is which one. I read The Prophet. I know The Prophet, so that's not the one. That's a great book as well. One of them is entitled This Present Darkness or Piercing the Darkness. I can't remember which one is which one. The one that took place in something with a school, I never really got a chance to finish reading that one. But there was another one where I think it was in the town of Asheville, where it's this pastor. That is a powerful, powerful book. That book will help you, by the grace of God, to open your eyes to understand a lot of things that go on in the spiritual realm. And especially when you see certain people behaving in a certain way towards you, it'll help you to understand. Because prior to that, I didn't quite understand too much. But after reading that book today, when I see certain people acting a certain way, I'm like, oh yeah, that's that moment I read about in that Frank Peretti book. It deals with spiritual warfare and a kind of like a Christian fiction setting, but a lot of what he writes about is stuff that we experience as believers. So it's a great book, you know, and there are two books. I had the privilege, I purchased those for myself as a birthday present. I think it was in 2016, and I had the privilege of reading them. The Prophet also is a very great book, you know, and there's some more books by him that I want to get a chance to read, you know, when I can. But great author, I recommend him. I also had the privilege of reading a book that he co-authored with Ted Dekker, which was The House. Lord have mercy. You think Stephen King crazy? Put him and Ted Dekker together? Woo! It'll knock your socks off. But the good thing about it, it shows you how the Lord works. Despite all that evil we may be facing, that there's always light at the end of the tunnel as long as we have Christ with us. Next up is Dee Henderson. Now, when I was in those book clubs, you know, you had to select a book by a certain date or else they would just send you something. And I was so busy oftentimes because back then I was in college as well as working a full-time job. So sometimes I didn't have time to keep up with stuff. And of course I didn't check off the box or send back the card or replied online that I don't want the book. So it came and it just sat there for years. And when I said years, I really mean years. I never touched it. Now, when I got to St. Martin, when I was moving back to St. Martin to live, I bought quite a bit of books, and the list was one of them that I bought to take back with me, which was by Robert Whitlow and Abiding Hope as well. I bought that. I had One Night with the King, so I had a couple of new books that I specifically bought, because back there we don't have that, like, you know, in St. Martin, and I love to read, like I said to you. So I took those back with me, and I read all the books. So I wanted something to read. There was nothing else left but that one book. So I had no choice. I had to read it. And let me tell you, I picked up that book and I read it. I can't remember what was the name of that book, but it was one of the books from the O'Malley family series. Oh my goodness. Talk about a gem and a treasure. I became a fan after that. That was it. And I read a couple more pieces from the O'Malley family series. Great books. Great writer. She's kind of like a female version of, would I say like Terri Blackstock mixed with some Robert Whitlow. Great. I mean, great suspense, you know, Christian fiction suspense writer as well. Great stuff. Next, we have Jacqueline Thomas, who's an African-American author. She was an author that was very popular, you know, back in the early, I would say the 90s into the early 2000s. Her first book was The Prodigal Husband. And, you know, that says that, you know, that kind of, the title speaks for itself. And if you've read the Prodigal Son, which is Luke 15, or is it 17? Luke 15. I think it's Luke 17, but it's Luke. And it's kind of like, if you read that story, it's kind of almost like the same thing. I'm back. I'm sorry, my camera kind of cut off, so I'm back. Yes, I was talking about Jacqueline Thomas. Jacqueline Thomas is an African-American Christian fiction author. I haven't seen her too much on the scene lately. When I last checked, about a couple of weeks ago, it seems like, I don't know, I'm not sure. Don't quite quote me on this. It looks like she kind of went back to writing contemporary fiction, so I'm not sure. But she has some great books. And The Prodigal Husband, like I was saying before, it's kind of like The Prodigal Son. It's just that instead of the son, it's the husband. And it's a great story. Great story. But I think my favorite book by her is Jezebel. Oh, you gotta read Jezebel. It's a tearjerker. The name speaks for itself. If you know who Jezebel is, well, this one will give you a run for the money as well. But it's a great story. You know, you have to read it till the end. It just shows you how great God, you know, His mercy is. Great book. So if you can pick it up, pick it up. Pick up a copy. Next, Kimberla, Lawson, Roby. I became a fan of Kimberla's, I believe, in 1997. I was living in New York, and I was in that book club, like I said to you, and I picked out a few of the Christian books. And her book was one of them, and it was Cast the First Stone. That was the first book to the beginning of the Curtis Black series. Lord Jesus, Curtis Black was a demon. But since then, she's written a ton of other books based on this series, and I can't tell you how many books there is at this point because I was not able to keep up, but there's a lot of them. But I have been able to jump in and pick up a few from the library, and I've read them, and they're good. And I'm so glad to know that, Jesus, Curtis Black changed. But nonetheless, as the series goes on, it's been going on for a long time, but it's great. You know, it's like each book is really good. You know, it's really, really good. And like I said, it's a very long series, but it hasn't lost its spice. You know, she has found a way to take and work that series. I mean, she knew how to work Curtis Black. She worked the heck out of Curtis Black, and it has worked for her. And like I said, you can pick up any one, but to understand the story better, you would, you know, start at the first book, Cast the First Stone. Great story. You'll understand as you go further as to why certain things are happening. Next up, new and noteworthy. Not to the writing world, but to me. And not necessarily new to me, because I knew who she was. You know, I've always known who she was, you know, like I said, because, you know, once you were part of the book club, they featured who these different Christian fiction authors were. I've always seen Beverly Lewis, but I was not intrigued to read anything by Beverly Lewis, I'm being honest. Especially back then. I mean, now I'm older. And in 2017, I was in the library. I was in New York City in the library, and I wanted a Christian fiction book to read. And I was scouring the shelves, looking, you know, for the beer, because I just about had read whatever was left in that particular branch. And as I was reading, most I had already read. Some I didn't really want to read. And then my eyes, after making 3-4 trips around the shelves, my eyes just happened to land on Beverly Lewis, and I'm like, so I picked it up. I read the back of the book to get a little more. I kind of knew, because she specializes in Christian fiction, but the Amish Christian, like, you know, about the Amish life. And I was not really interested in reading that, I'll be honest with you, at least so I thought. So being that there was nothing else left to read, once again, I'm like, okay, well, I guess I got to read this. I'm not going to read anything secular. And, oh my goodness, ooh. You know when you pass up on something? Like I did with Dee Henderson? Same thing. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I love her books. And the first one I read was The Reckoning, and I was in the middle of reading The Shunning, but I never got to finish it because, like I said, time constraints. But as far as I got in that second book, it was a great book. And it made me want to get more of her books, and I still do. And it also made me want to look more and learn a little bit more about that Amish life, you know. Being the fact that I also grew up in the Caribbean, and I understand certain things because we were raised, you know, a certain way as well. So certain things I do understand. And it definitely gave me a lot more respect for the culture, you know, and stuff like that. And like I said, the stories, the book was just amazing. Amazing, amazing, amazing. I just felt so warm and good reading those books. And I'm truly thankful that I had the opportunity to read it, because now she's one of my favorites on my list. Next up, also new and noteworthy to me, not to the writing world, same scenario. This was a library in Chinatown in New York City. So it was very small. So it ain't had too much Christian, much less fiction in that library. but I wanted something to read, and my eyes happened to glance on it. It was new, so it was sitting, excuse me, on the shelf, in the new section. And when I saw her name, because I know her name, I'm like, that's Christian fiction. So I decided to check it out. Oh man, I loved it. And it's from the Heart of the Alaska series. Great book, and it's based on these historical stories about this mountain, in Alaska, and like during the 1800s. It's just an awesome story. Awesome story. I read the first book. I got to the second book. In the middle, of course, I had to take it back because, like I said, time. So I had to take it back to the library. So, being the fact that things have gotten better finance-wise, after that, the loss of everything during Hurricane Irma, I look forward once again to starting to rebuild my book library again. And these are some of the books that I would like to get, because I always prefer to purchase the books, because the books were so great because I can take my time and read them at my own leisure, as well as these were books that I can keep. I can, loan them to someone. I can pull it back out a couple years from now and reread it again. And that's the beauty of owning, for me, your own book. So, because some of these books, the stories are so awesome, you're gonna want to have them in your collection to pass them down to, whether it's a sister, a brother, a child who might like to read, or like I said, you can go back and read it again over and over as many times as you would like to. Beautiful book. Now, in urban Christian fiction, I have read a lot of urban Christian fiction, books. A whole lot. And a lot of them are very good. And some of the names of the authors I do not remember. Some of them I've only read one book from them, but whatever the book was, it was great. There were a few that I will not mention their names. I did not like their books. But for the most part, the majority of them I did like. Scot has a series. It's a 2-book series. I like to call it the Devil series. The first one is Speak of the Devil. The title speaks for itself. And then the follow-up to that, which is also the conclusion, is Up Pops the Devil. Great book. So if you can find that, that's a good book as well. Those are 2 good books. And like I said, once again, the author is Scot. M. Scott. Michelle Andrea Bowen. I read her book years ago. Church Folk. Ooh, Lord, if you want to be hollering and hooping, you need to read Church Folk. If I remember correctly, I think there was a book too. And I read that too. Hey, you got to read Church Folk. It'll leave you rolling. And I also had that in my collection as well. And that was one of the books that also, Irma decided to take it and go with it. And then Victoria Christopher Murray's another great African-American writer that writes, Christian fiction. The first book I read from her was Temptation. Temptation was very good. Lady Jasmine, there's a Lady Jasmine series. I read that. There's a couple of other that I read from her. I don't remember the names right now, but she has a slew of titles. You can go and you can check her out as well. Angela Benson, Abiding Hope. Ted Dekker. Ted Dekker, I have only read that book that he co-authored with Frank Peretti. That was bone-chilling. And then I had taken out a book at the library from him. I do not remember the name of that book, but it's a book with this guy. He was like an assassinator or something, but he was a priest. I didn't finish the book, but that was an intriguing book, and I would like to go back and finish it, but it was this thick. So, of course, I didn't get through it because, once again, I had to take it back, and being the time constraints on my schedule, I was not able to finish reading. But for whatever I was able to read, I definitely liked what I was reading. And quite frankly, it's a book that I would prefer to own, because that way I can read it at my own leisure, and I could have it, you know, in my own personal library as well. And so that's it for this video. The next video, I will be sharing it with you my favorite Christian fiction reads. So thank you so much once again for joining me. Stay tuned for the next video. Hey, hi, welcome and welcome back to my channel once again. And of course, I'm Arlena, and today I'm coming to you with another special video. And in today's video, I will be speaking, or actually sharing with you, some of my favorite Christian fiction authors. Stay tuned.